Welcome, welcome, Facebook Live. Here we are. And we are here. This is Let's Talk About Race. We are the Let's Talk About Race podcast. And I am Diane Wong, and my fellow podcasters.
Pharaoh Saunders, always happy to be here.
Good evening, everyone. Charles Minton, pleasure to be before you all today.
And so we, as usual, before we came on today, we started having really interesting discussions. We don't get together, the three of us, very often, but we've got a lot going on. So, we have good things to talk about. So we're bringing those things to you and to this space today. So one of the things that we ended with just before we jumped on here was this question of, are we being specific when we're talking about people and groups and issues, or do we always, or is it better to lump everybody in? And it came up because I was commenting that news people in particular often speak of people of color all the time, no matter what it is, people of color, except when there's an issue like a Black man was killed by the police, and they can say that. But we were asking ourselves the question, under what circumstance are we lumping everybody together, and why don't we? Why does it or does it not make sense to always speak of people of color? That's a question so you both can join and start to talk and give.
I think that's pretty simple. I think that you should use vague terms when you need to be open-ended. That's why vague terms exist. So if you are talking about a very wide and varied group of people, then use a vague term. If you're trying to be more specific, then be more specific. I feel like there's not a whole lot of controversy, or there shouldn't be at least. I think that there is some amount for some reason. I feel like people, especially very socially conscious people, tend to use the term people of color and overuse it, even in circumstances in which a term that vague isn't necessary or even helpful, or can even be detracting from your actual message in how vague it is in a situation that doesn't warrant it. But they do it because they feel as though it is somehow the least offensive thing that could be said, even when being specific in a circumstance wouldn't be offensive.
Let me just add something to there, and then Charles, I'm interested to see. It's always interesting for me to see the differences and the similarities in our thinking about these topics. I think that for the same reason that in 2017 we started a radio show called Let's Talk About Race. That was why, because there is such hesitancy to talk about race, or even say the R word, race, but even more hesitancy to say Black. And so what Pharaoh just said, I'm thinking of newscasters or people who race doesn't just flow out of their mouth. And so they'll say people of color, and I'll bet one of the reasons is that they'd say they don't want to offend anybody. And that always makes me, in a society that believes that everybody's equal, and that we've done away with discrimination, then why are we hesitant and believe that saying that I see a Black man over there, that somehow that Black man is going to be offended by someone saying that he's Black? And so I think that gets to the core of a lot of the problem that we have in this country. Charles?
Interesting point. And I think this particular subject resonates with me. I have a 9-year-old son, and for the first time, I would say maybe a couple of days ago, I took notice of him actually having a perspective of being a Black man in America. And it was as simple as him and I just sitting down and watching, what was the name of this cartoon? So on Netflix, some spinoff of Jurassic Park or something. And there was 5 or 6 young people, and they were trying to get out of the Jurassic Park, whatever was going on. Dinosaurs were chasing them, but that's besides the point. But but within the cartoon, there was a main character who happened to be a young Black male. And then from there, you had an Asian male, I believe, and then you had a couple of white females and someone else. So just in talking with my son Charlie, and I asked him, well, Charles, do you like the show? I said, yeah, I like it because they have a Black character who's the leader, Daddy. I was like, wow. I was like, interesting. Please tell me more. What do you mean?
And, like literally. Planet.
Yeah, exactly. I wish he could talk more about the show, but maybe I'll get it for the next podcast. But like, just to hear him say, well, Daddy, I don't watch a lot of shows where I see Black characters leading. And that really hit home for me, just in terms of this idea of colored or Black, because I think the messaging in terms of our needs has, quote unquote, been hijacked due to, of course, Black folks representing the lower end of the totem pole in a lot of ways. So when other folks sort of jump on our bandwagon in terms of being oppressed, whether that be LGBTQ, whether that be other, various, disenfranchised ethnic or groups within our country, they sort of jump on this bandwagon in terms of, yeah, let's support Black people in their struggle, but yes, but of course you guys have your struggle, but here's our struggle. So in a lot of ways, I think unfortunately our needs often are sort of placed secondary to perhaps LGBTQ and other components, because there is not a focus specifically on Black issues and the needs of Black people within this country. So I do think there needs to be a distinction and perhaps an eradication of even the use of colored, because it's like, what does that even mean? To Pharaoh people like colored, what do you mean? Anyone can be colored. So I think there needs to be a distinction made, particularly from Black people, in terms of identifying with being Black as opposed to being colored in this country.
I think that abolishing vague terms is unhelpful, because sometimes just for statistical reasons it's necessary in order to use words like that. But I do agree with you that in overuse of those, it causes more specific concerns to be lost, and that's why a lot of the time you find these sorts of needs buried underneath other things. There's no reason that you can't have both of those things at the same time. And specifically, as like a community or as a group, our focus can be on this specific need, which is on the Black community and on Black issues. Issues involving the whole don't need to be on the shoulders of Black people alone. That's ridiculous. That's something that everyone can contribute some energy to, but everyone's primary energy, especially when it comes to people in underprivileged communities, can be on theirs. So our concern can be on the needs of our community primarily. And it takes very little energy to siphon some of that and put that into other things, because being aware of things outside of your immediate experience, I think, is important for anyone. But that doesn't mean that we can't donate the majority of our effort and of our concentration on those aspects which can be neglected. So yeah, I agree with that.
Well, one of the, I have specific reasons for that, because if you look back, as we do a lot here in the Racial Justice Collaborative, we're all members of the Racial Justice Collaborative here. And we have done a lot of work, and our work has taken us back to before the country was established. And one of the things that is clear is since this country was built for white people, not by white people, but it was always intended to benefit white people. And so at the same time it was benefiting white people, at the far end of that, it was detracting from and taking away from Black people. And that was how everybody, a lot of people found that to be fine. That was just the way that it was. But what I see is from the 18th century on forward, you see continuing issues of Black people raising the concern, wanting to be citizens, wanting to not be subject to discrimination for centuries. And here we are in 2021, and when you look at COVID, you see that the large numbers of both essential workers, a lot of those essential workers are low level, low paid work, not low level. I mean, it's like teachers, they're not low level, but they're too low paid for us to demand that they get back in the classroom. We need, look at, this is a tangent, but look at football players. Look how much they make. But they're not teaching our children. And now when it's time you want to go to work and you want the teachers to take their life in their hands, but you want to say they're not worth 50, 60, 70, 80, 150, nothing close to what we pay other people. So there's that. But the other thing is that over the years, we've seen other groups. Clearly, the Chinese Exclusion Act was targeted Chinese people and all Asians, because people see a Chinese.
Despite the name, it did target all Asians.
They see an Asian, but then you see that. But over time, just like other immigrant groups, more complicated than other immigrant groups, but like even the white immigrant groups that had issues, they managed to work through those things, and the Italians and everybody. So, but if you look from the beginning of the country till right now, the one group that is consistently discriminated against and even killed by the police consistently is Black people. So I'm not.
But there's a pretty specific reason for that, why that's different from the other groups that you described, like how obviously there's a long history of discrimination against Asians, but how you can see sort of various trends in that with the United States and how that could change, and how you're saying that there is a consistent level with Black people in the United States. So the primary reason for that is through external politics. Yes. And politics of economy, yes. Right? Like like when that first big change happened to stop, insanely demonizing Chinese people in the United States, that didn't really stop until the 40s, when China was a U.S. ally in World War II. And there's truly ridiculous, sort of pamphlets about this. There's one that I read that was how to tell the good ones from the bad ones, and it was just horribly racist caricatures about this is a Chinese one, they're good, this is a Japanese one, they're bad, etc. This stuff like that, because the point is that's about external political necessity of having China being seen in at least a way of being a ally of the United States because of the largest scale of war possible, which is a world war, in which they're fighting against the Japanese along with the United States in the Pacific theater. And then there was a massive vilification of Japanese people specifically. And then you had the Japanese internment camps and stuff like that. And that started to change, sometime later, towards the 80s and the 90s, when Japan became a massively important economic trading partner with the United States. So then there was external political pressure to, and a change in the sort of social lens and how they were viewed because of that pressure of their country, where those people were from and where that culture originates, having a direct tie and a positive sense of power influence on the world stage. And I think that you can say similar things about European immigrants in the United States in earlier American history. I would say that had more to do with cultural similarity and religious similarities over time, as certain divides in the United States became less important. Like the divide between Protestantism and Catholicism used to be really important. That became less important over time in the United States, stuff like that. But with those, particularly with Asian immigrants, you can see that those changes are largely because of external pressures.
Well,
Because
I mean,
people wanted to appease China or see China as an ally.
Even the Europeans, like the Italians, that came about because of external pressure as well. I totally agree with you. I'm just saying that in the case of Africa, there was always this taking out and taking away and using up, and that's where a lot of the
because that same pressure doesn't exist, though. Like, my point is that it's not like like wasps, like American wasps, just decided one day, like, you know what? Let's be more accepting of Asian people.
No, you're right. You're right.
They didn't choose to. It's because there was reason for that in the socioeconomic political world. It's not like they just opened up their heart one day. It's like, you know what? Let's not be bigoted to them. There's reason for that, and that same pressure doesn't exist for African Americans, and it certainly doesn't exist for Black people in general, because African countries aren't just, well, there are some examples of African countries doing things like this, but not enough to cause something like this, where African countries just sort of claim African Americans and sort of speak up for them on the world stage. That doesn't exist.
Right.
Even in points where it's slightly like that, like Ghana opening up citizenship to African Americans that I'll reach out for, which I think is really cool, isn't the same as this massive, world stage level economic pressure that countries like China or Japan or Korea can do, and the countries like the United States that used to, and still do, obviously. There still is obviously bigotry against Asians, but it's changed massively from how it used to be in the United States, and I would say largely for those reasons.
I don't disagree with you, Pharaoh, on why, but what I'm saying is it still exists, and so we're looking at the question of harnessing a big effort toward or for Black people, and it must be because there's none of that external pressure, so we have to do that internally.
Yep.
And not even external pressure. Right. And it's even beyond external pressure. It's a sense of nationalism that the majority of other ethnic groups feel in this particular country, because they have an outside country to really point towards having an affinity or love for. So, in other words, Chinese Americans here can sort of point to their love for the actual, country of China. And, of course, God forbid, if the United States did something punitive or did something egregious to Chinese people within this country, there will be, oh my God, there'll be repercussions from the Chinese government directly, and that's in reference to every other ethnic group in this country except for Black Americans, just a sense of nationalism and connection to an outside country. And I think that sort of ties into the need for just being really specific in terms of outlining Black initiatives, because I think now we're teetering on lethargy or indifference at the moment. Just even looking at Biden's executive orders, looking at that the other day. He has one: restoring faith in our legal immigration system, establishment of interagency task force, reunification of families, creating a comprehensive regional framework to address the cause of immigration. That's super immigration so far. Strengthening Medicaid, tackling climate crisis, President's Councils on Advisors, Science and Technology.
I think there's something about
but I think
racial reckoning, but there's no teeth in it yet. There's no.
That's my point.
That's just a vague reference that it's time to do a racial reckoning.
And that's my point. I think because there's a vagueness in terms of just even the struggle in itself, it's been, I think, hijacked by the needs of other ethnic groups and other aspects within our country, whereas the needs of Black Americans, just even looking at executive orders, I mean, there's one at the very end.
Those
in terms
are really
of
tangible things also, right?
Advancing, racial equity.
What does that mean? Like, what law is that? There's such a thing. There's an entire field of law around immigration law. That's a very tangible thing. what is racial reckoning? That's super vague.
I tell you what, I tell you what, it's reparations.
Well,
I think it's very simple. You know what I mean?
Well, those are different. I would love to talk about reparations, right? But first of all, anyone that ever thought Joe Biden would be a champion of reparations is kidding themselves. I think that's ridiculous.
Well, for the Black cause, even having a perspective in terms of helping Black people, he hasn't even put that within his initial initiatives, if that's even a phrase.
Well,
so I think we need to be worried.
It, right? But that's a very vague thing to say. There's not an action that you can, or a tangible action. If you're saying, I think that equating African American reparations with the concept of racial justice in general, I think that's a leap. I think that that's an example of something that could be that. But one, I think it's a pretty extreme example that a very famously moderate Joe Biden is not gonna support. That's ridiculous. No, like there's a handful of Democrats that were in the Democratic primary that even brought it up, and he was not one of them. So like I definitely don't think that's even going to be close to.
And you know what? And you know what? When we see this, then it's time for us to do something. So now, Charles, I'm starting to, in process work, you can start off and have a real big specific position that you take, but then as you hear and you experience and you see, then you start to shift. And so I'm over here now with Charles, and I see that the Racial Justice Collaborative, in collaboration with Diane Wong Consulting and other groups, can say, okay, it's time to do something. And then we need to come out with some projects that specifically do some of what we're talking about. And Charles, you have been really clear. I argued with you at one time about when you said it's just time, you don't want to see the momentum die, and you want people to do something. And that was just to keep the energy moving. So I think we're going to have to say, it's you, Charles. You're going to lead this. And it can be reparations, if that's what you want. I want that too. So does Pharaoh. We all want that. Or it can be steps toward that or whatever. But I think we have to state it and be clear about it and start to put that forward and keep putting that forward. And so let's do that. I support you. Take that on. I support you 100%. That's a project, and we can get the Racial Justice Collaborative to support that.
That sounds like an awesome project to get started on.
The project is called Don't Let This Moment Die.
Absolutely.
We've got the COVID. It's like the universe is pushing everything toward us and saying, grab this and run, grab that and run. And if we don't grab it and run, then, because when you're both speaking, I just remember the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in that Civil Rights Act, remember when you watch Eyes on the Prize, all black, black kids going to jail, black parents going to jail, black everybody, getting beat up. And so, but when there was finally this, what they called racial reckoning, and they came forward with the program, they called it affirmative action. And in that, they said, it's not just going to be for black people. They threw white women in, they threw Asians, they threw Latinos. I mean, and I'm not saying that all these folks don't have an axe to grind and worked towards something, but it took away the strength of it. And so now 50 or however long many years that was, 70 years later, black people still are not part of this country in the way that we are. We are part of this country, but we are not benefiting. And there's still rampant discrimination. And so then we've got to call for something that is for black people. And we need everybody, we need all these other people of color groups and the LGBTQI. We need all of them to support this 100%.
So speaking of that, I would like to talk about reparations, because I think that that's a very interesting concept, and it's something that, it's something that we have talked about in the group before, but not in a while, to my memory, at least not in detail. So I think that would be interesting, especially on the topic of something specifically for Black people.
Right.
So my first question on the concept of reparations would be, what would these reparations be? Well, first, what manner of reparations would it be? Whether that's financial, any other sort of aspects, legal, social, whatever. Would it be? What group would it be for? And what sort of amount or quantity could it be, measured in?
And the criteria also for who.
I think to that point, it could be anyone who could sort of like place their lineage to, I guess, a slave or someone who was in the slave trade in any aspects. I think that would be an initial first start, just in terms of everyone just being able to point directly to.
What slave trade, though, specifically? Like, do you mean African American slave trade? Because that wouldn't include like Afro-Caribbeans or Afro-South Americans or anything like that.
No, I think we're focusing in on Black Americans at this moment.
That's fair, but I've asked this question and people couldn't even, narrow down on that. I think I agree that if there was anything that the United States government was going to do, there's no way that they would do anything else.
Right.
Like that they would try to they're going to try to make it as narrow as possible. So I think that you have to sort of take some kind of lens with that. So but I do
think with regard to this, I think we perhaps need to just make this our next, do our research, because I do recall there being an individual who essentially every year he's sort of put on the table in terms of there being a reparations law, but every year it was shot down within our government. I got to do my research just in remembering the name of that law. Is it HR 40? I don't know. I think it might be HR 4. I don't know. I got to double check.
I think it's HR 44. It's the 40 acres and a mule.
Correct.
mean, that's where the United States, there's a lot of touch points where the United States government has discriminated. And but also has discriminated against a lot of people. So, but I think that when you're talking about Black people, and not just Black people, when you're talking about people with African American lineage that can trace their lineage back to slavery, I think that is a whole different piece of what we're talking about. So
I think there's so many
but I agree with Pharaoh. That's a place to start, because
that's getting into the. You can go. Sorry, Charles.
Yeah, I was just gonna say there's so many layers to that, because I don't know if a lot of folks are aware that there were Black indigenous folks already in this country. So, prior to Columbus coming here, there's been documentation to say that there were Black folks already here, and then from there,
define Black folks in that
Black indigenous, however you want to, describe them in terms of Black indigenous people.
Well, what does Black mean in that context, though?
Black means that at some point from Africa, they made it here to the Americas.
I've never seen anything credible about that. I've seen and I've read a fair share of interesting work about that, primarily about like Prince Ali III of Mali and the transatlantic voyage that he attempted, but I have not seen any sort of credible research.
And I think that goes to the lack of, I think that goes to the heart of white supremacy, just in terms of white people paint the narrative, because of course, do the victors go to spoil? So I think they painted the narrative that it was only on the ships that were created by Europeans that folks of color, Black people from Africa made it here to the Americas. Whereas perhaps if, folks did their history and, we were sort of enlightened to the fact that perhaps, we were able to create the boats to come here and the ships to come here on our own.
I'm not convinced of that, because
because we have the taught. That's something we taught in the history books. You know what I mean?
I do my history. I look in lots of different places in order to do it, and but I haven't seen any evidence of that. And like everything else, if there's no evidence of that, it's a conspiracy theory. And I think that there's some small amounts of tangential historical record of things like that being attempted, but that doesn't mean that they happened. And there's other things to look into as to where sort of impact that might have. Where would African archaeological record be? So there would be some form of African style buildings in the Americas. There would be some form of African based currency in the Americas, because those things were all used. There'd be Malian currency, because Mali very famously made and minted metal gold currency. So not something that would erode, not something that would dissolve, nothing like that. It would be in the Americas, and it's just not. So I don't see much evidence of that personally.
Well, I mean, and I think this is where, this kind of broad discussion is really good. But I think that if we want to talk about something that's owed to African Americans, if we want to have, it's got to have a lineage to slavery, not just being here in this country, because there were Native Americans here, well, that's a whole different story. But then Native Americans, well, actually, Native Americans now have sovereignty and have managed to get
in
sovereignty.
In a way, sovereignty.
In a way, I mean,
sovereignty is a strong word.
Some groups of Native Americans have managed to get wealth. That's all. But in terms of, if we want to look at a debt, it's like Randall Robinson wrote the book many years ago called The Debt. The debt that is owed to African Americans. I think that's the most solid thing that we can at least start with. I mean, there's plenty when you start looking at Separate but Equal and Brown versus Board of Education and all the people who have have been persecuted and discriminated against. But the people who the United States owes a debt, and that's why it's called HR 40, because the debt was actually stated 40 acres and a mule. That's what.
And I think that law was shut down by Andrew Johnson, I believe, right?
Well, it was some general that went. It was said.
Right. So in other words, it passed, but then the president said, no, hold on, we can't give the reparations out. Let's come back to another point that was like shut down.
Yeah, that was shut down. But that's the reason it's called HR 40. But the more that we can pinpoint and say, first of all, we had hundreds of years of slavery. We're not talking about, 20 a generation. We're talking about hundreds of years of slavery. And so those hundreds of years of slavery, there's a debt for that. And that's bigger debt than just 40 acres and a mule.
So there's a lot of complicated things that go into this, right? And I think it's worth talking about because it's really interesting, because this is where we get into the weeds of this concept. So one, we're narrowing it down to a specific ethnic group, because Black is a racial group, which is a very open-ended thing. It means anyone that's African descended, right? But we're talking about African Americans specifically, which are, the descendants of people that were brought to the continental United States and enslaved there. So already in that context, we are not talking about Afro-Caribbeans. We're not talking about people from the African continent that immigrated after the fact. We are not talking about people like Afro South American people, anything like that.
Nope.
So
absolutely.
And I think that, I think that you would have no chance. This is already a long shot as the theoretical concept thinking about the United States government and how it would treat this, but there's no way that you convince them to do any more than that. So now that we've done that narrowed, we have to think about, so in what context is that? Because specifically in the United States, lots of people that would not be identified or even self-considered Black have African American lineage. So one, how can you prove African American lineage? And two, even if you do have it proven, at what degree, like what percentage of African ancestry do you need to have in order to qualify for this? Because there's all sorts of white people that are slave owner descended that have partial Black DNA. So would they be able to qualify for this? And they could probably prove it in their historical records that they have African American ancestry. So in what sense and what sort of cutoffs do you have to do in order to work around that?
And I think, Pharaoh, what you're talking about, I think that's where politicians.
Good questions.
I think to that point, I think that was put on the table, I believe, by folks who don't want to see these laws passed. And just even going back to, what you said about Biden, I think it goes even beyond Biden. I recall Bernie Sanders and Obama, not, wanting to even have a conversation about reparations. So it's even beyond just Biden, with regards to this conversation. But I think specifically, I think it's important to flesh that out. I do think that, but I think initially there should be some sort of enacted law, which is long overdue, which should have been in place yesterday, just in terms of, I believe this country offering some sort of apology in terms of which they've done to other ethnic groups within this country. I think that that's a good start. And there's historical perspective in terms of this country providing an apology for, I guess, certain ridiculous acts of violence infringed upon by this government. So there's precedence for that. But for whatever reason, that refuses to take place within, for Black Americans in this country.
There is precedence for that, but nothing, right. No precedent for something so old. So there is precedent for things in modern history like that, like the right. Japanese internment, stuff like that. But that's all right. Stuff that happened, within the last century.
I think it goes back to your earlier point in terms of that being done because of outside influence, because of the GDP, and of course because of what China and Japan represented, in terms of gross domestic product, around the world. But I think once we flesh out the need for some sort of apology and of course a specific law that sort of outlines a specific, tangible amount of money or monies directly provided for Black Americans in this country, who of course can, provide the connection between, their descendants being in the slave trade in some capacity. I think that right there is an initial first start that has not taken place in hundreds of years within this country. And I think that needs to take place immediately, because now just even looking at, some of the initiatives that I'm hearing from the Biden administration, even go back to your point, Diane, we really can't expect anyone to sort of take on this cause but us as Black folks. And I think right. And it's not going to happen unless we take on the cause for ourselves. Right. And
even that's recognize that there's a need. Because even that's interesting though, because I not that I can think of, I can't remember ever having a conversation like this with a Black non-African American person, and there are plenty of those. So it would be very interesting to see what their point of view on this is, because Black people, regardless of specific ethnicity, in the modern day, share a lot of the same struggles. And that doesn't relate to what we're talking about here, because this reparation, this legal financial reparation, would not be for a modern issue. It's for an antiquated issue that obviously has modern consequences because of how incredibly generational it is. But it's interesting because this would not go to benefit anyone that isn't African American. So this wouldn't benefit Jamaican Americans. This wouldn't benefit Haitian Americans. This wouldn't benefit Nigerian Americans. Nothing like that.
Well, and I think I think everyone all Black people in the diaspora should be compensated for the history.
Sure, but that's not up to the United States. It's just a question
of where should they seek the compensation from. So if you come from a country where it was colonized by the Spanish, you're going to have to go after Spain. Or you go after France.
Good luck with that now.
After England.
Right.
So
maybe England, but Spain, I don't think is going to be coughing up any money for reparations for their colonies right now.
Well, but see, look, it's been hundreds of years and we haven't received it. In hundreds of years, things can change greatly for Spain. So, but I think it's important that we do it, because even it's like what Pharaoh just said. You never have a conversation with a non-African American Black person, and see, because then it's a nuanced whole thing. Because there are a lot of Black people that didn't come out of slavery. They're Black people, but they were in the United States and they were lynched. And they were treated the same way as all Black people. That's what Black people find out once we come here. We're all going to be lumped in and treated the same.
Yep, and it's interesting because, even in my personal friend group, as mostly Black, but I, with the exception of one other person, am the only African American. So it'll be interesting to have that conversation, because we're obviously speaking about this from a vantage point of being African American and thinking about it in that context. But that's different depending on, what ethnicity you happen to be from and where those colonial roots are. Because we have, obviously, a further back ancestral root that's similar, but our colonial roots are different. And that's the context in which we're talking about reparations here.
Well, but see, the thing is, that's what Charles keeps bringing up, or at least is bringing up now. The problem is that there's no platform, there's no organized effort to even have the discussion, because just because the three of us get on here and agree that it should be African Americans from slavery, you know, it may turn into something different. And I'm,
it's funny,
I'm all
even
for that. I'm all for it, but I want to have the discussion, and I want it to be a serious discussion that's happening in the United States, that we can do it at all of our different schools and university, and have this big discussion. It can be televised so the whole country can watch.
And I think this is a good initial, I mean, it's not a first start, but I just think just in terms of platforms like this collaborative, just having a conversation. I think like even now we're sort of like developing our own protocols in terms of like, what would that entail in terms of like, for who, like for which specific amount of people. And then of course, the next conversation is how much, and then when, and then, you know, so it's just, you know, how do we break it out in terms of, will it be money? Would it be land? I mean, you know, I think just by us having this initial conversation and other folks having this conversation is a great first start, just to get the momentum and keep it going. But just, you know, even reflecting on, I remember Ice Cube during the presidential election, just wanting to have the conversation. He was vilified for it because I guess he was, in folks' eyes, I guess they looked at him as just being a pawn for Trump, whereas I see what saying, well, listen.
It's how people heard it. I don't think people heard what he said.
But it's ridiculous because it was actually like, you know, he made a lot of sense, but because from Ice Cube's perspective, he's like, you know, listen, I went to Biden. He said he didn't want to talk about that after the election. Trump said, hey, man, let's talk about it. But I think black folks were just saying, oh my God, you can't support Trump. He's a racist. You know what I mean? But he
wasn't supporting him. That's not the same.
He just wanted to have a conversation. At least the man, you know, wants to sit down with him. You know what I mean? And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's. Okay, so we've established that we want to do this and we want to have this discussion. Now, let's think in terms of a project that the three of us can. Oh, I think we have a project already, and I asked Charles to lead that, right?
Yes, you did.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Charles, how do we start? I mean, really, here we are, the Racial Justice Collaborative. Now, what are our first steps? Do we have to like bring it to the Racial Justice Collaborative? And I think, yeah, because that's our first step in starting to develop support, because we're going to have a lot of support for this. If we don't have support, it's going to be just the three of us talking on this podcast.
Right.
So
no, I think it's important to flesh out, you know, an action plan, you know, just, I guess that could represent a conversation amongst the collaborative in terms of what would that look like. And I think you started that just in terms of the accountability piece within the collaborative. Like what are we willing to do, each individual, separate from the collaborative, just individual, like what are you willing to do in terms of this cause? Right. And then from there, right, I think it's spearheading. I think what we did today, I think was quite powerful, you know, and we did it within a matter of minutes, you know, just in terms of like developing like a framework in terms of, you know, for Black Americans, this is what it potentially could look like. And I think within the collaborative, you know, that could, you know, that could morph, I think, into.
And you know, here's an opportunity to look at the fact that within the collaborative, there are other people who are also Black, and not just the three of us. I mean, there are other people who are not Black, but we have other Black people. And I mean, I don't know for sure every single one of the Black people, if everybody's an African American. So it might be that the next step is to convene a group, the whole African American group within the collaborative, and have a discussion like this and see.
And I think, and I'm sorry, I forgot the initial, I think the primary step, and I think it goes back to our initial, I don't call it a question, our initial thoughts. We have to be crystal clear in terms of this is a cause specifically for Black Americans. So we want to make it as specific as possible. You know, we want to eliminate the colored aspect or, you know, various other things, which I think we want to be really specific in terms of we're working.
But Charles, there you go. There's a big, we just jumped over about 50% of the discussion. I think we have to back it up. I think we need to have people who step forward and say, this is what I believe it should be. Right. And then even within the collaborative, and then to say, okay, we may even develop position papers. Okay, this is what we want to, this is what we're talking about. Reparations for African Americans for the crime of slavery. Absolutely. And so that's it. And then, but we convene the whole group of Black people within the collaborative. And if other people have a different perspective, then they bring forward their perspective. And then we just see what that feels like, because there's a lot of Black people in this country that,
Mm-hmm.
that do not have roots in slavery. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and we're not going to be able to say, okay, you guys, we're not talking to you. We want your support.
It's roots in American slavery specifically, right? Because every Afro-Caribbean, every
Yeah,
Afro-South American have roots in
African
slavery,
American
but
slavery.
it's not slavery in this country, which is the country that this theoretical model is asking for money from.
Yeah,
So
because
that's the issue.
and it's because we're asking for money from the United States of America, and that's why we've got this limitation. And that's part of our argument. That's part of our platform. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to see if other people have something else to say, and we need to listen to them. And then we can still say, okay, but we're still going to go forward with what we talked about. But we need to hear, because
Right.
when they bring forward their, if we just close them down too fast, then we're not going to get the collaboration and the cooperation that we need. Because here we are, 3 people, and to get something onto the world stage, or at least on the United States stage, we're going to have to be, speaking from strength.
From truth, you speak truth to power. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
But see, we can do that too. We could go, because this that we're doing today is going to be telecast. It's going to be available. It's in the Somerville Media Center, public access TV. So we may take, like what you said earlier, we may take a snippet of that and just go out there and start to beat the bushes and say, this is who we are, this is what we believe, and this is what we're moving toward. And we want people who agree with us to join us. That's another way we can do it.
I think it even goes back to a previous conversation we've had in terms of outlining what we want. And I think, unfortunately,
yes.
I think as a people, we don't know what we want. We've been conditioned to be told what we should want, by this white supremacist propaganda media vehicle, in terms of, well, you don't want to worry about reparations. Don't worry about that. Focus in on this, and I think as Black folks, it's really important for us to outline what we think we should have. It's not, it's even, to me, I think it's even beyond in terms of like what we want, what we wish, and what we want to ask for. I think it's what we should probably demand. We should, no, not probably. We should demand, because this is owed to us. It's even beyond asking for it.
Yeah.
We should, at this point, demand it,
and
as opposed to asking for it.
Limit ourselves by saying we are only going to ask for this much because we don't think they're going to give it to us. So let's not even look at that. Let's look at, what do we believe we are owed?
Right.
And let's go with that. Let's start. That's our biggest position of strength and power. What do we believe?
I think that's difficult, right? Because the thing that I think African Americans are owed by the country isn't a financial sum of money. It's something else. It's something far less tangible, but that's obviously not something you can ask for. So it's about trying to, translate that into a financial sum of money and how much that's worth, because it's about having equal footing. But you can't, that's not a thing. You can't get a check for equal footing. So it's about trying to imagine what the financial equivalent for that is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not just equal footing. We're talking about our ancestors who were captured, so however it happened,
I know,
put on ships and brought to the United States and sold, and families were separated and sold down the river in all different places.
I know, so but besides besides us physically existing because of that, the other modern impact that it has is that it set African Americans back very far.
Yes,
just like all enslaved groups have been set back very far. So what I'm saying is, what we would theoretically have in a ideal world would be equal footing, because that's the way, that's what we don't have, and we're set back for that reason, and that's something that's generationally set us back. But we can't ask for that, because that's not something that can be granted. So it instead has to be a financial sum that should approximate, or the best that we think we can have to equate to that.
Okay, so we're about at the end of our time. I want to make sure that all of this whole program is able to go on the show. So we've got a couple of minutes, but not many. So, so Charles, you're in charge of this.
Okay.
I'm supporting you. Pharaoh is supporting you within the collaborative. So,
Right.
so whatever you believe, let's just, whatever you believe is the way for us to go forward. Let's talk about that and then make that happen.
Right. And I think to that point, I just need all people, not only Black Americans, please don't get lulled to sleep at this time. I think we looked at the previous 4 years as being in wartime, and we were at war with Trump in the government. And I guess now folks are looking at it, well, okay, everything's okay now. Everything is not okay, because I think now we're recognizing that, the things that we hoped the government would just take, I guess, focus on, or even just have a opinion on. That's not going to happen. So I just think now it's for us, to what we've been saying, to sort of outline what we want and be really specific and move forward in terms of its implementation.
Yeah, I agree, because other than that, without the external pressure, which we don't have, then we're just begging. We're just taking our hat in our hand and we're saying, please, Massa, give us our rights. Let us be like you white folks.
Right.
But we're not asking for that. We want what is owed to us, and that is, we have to determine that.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to say right here and right now that we're committed to putting a spark under this movement. Other people are doing this too. We'll find out who they are. But here in the Racial Justice Collaborative, under Charles's leadership, Pharaoh and I are working with you. But you're going to do the leadership. You're the one that wants. You're the one that feels the energy for it. So does Pharaoh. But anyway, so does that make sense, Pharaoh? Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree completely.
Okay, Charles, do you agree?
I do. Let's do it.
Okay, so you're going to take the leadership, and you let me know, and we'll try to figure out who the Black people are within the collaborative, and we'll send something to them.
But listen, even to that point,
it's not a secret. Everybody will know, but we're going to start by finding out what the other Black people think about that.
Right, and then from there extending it, because Lou is Blacker than a lot of Black people that I know. So just even incorporating a lot of folks to help this movement push it forward.
Yes. Yeah. Let's do that. First, though, let's get the actual people that are actually have some Black lineage.
That definitely helps.
And then,
absolutely.
and then see what. And it doesn't mean that everybody has to be in lockstep, because some people can say, "You guys go for it," but I don't have time. That's fine. But at least every voice, because remember, every voice must be heard. So we're going to do that. But then I agree with you entirely. After we state our position within the collaborative, we'll then open it up to everybody. But if you're not Black, then I'm not going to put any limits. So Charles, this is your thing. So
okay, let's do it.
Okay, so let's do it. Okay. So thank you, everybody. This has been good. Now we're starting a movement here. Reparations for African Americans for the crime of slavery in the United States of America.
Right on.
Okay, thank you, Facebook Live. And this will be up very soon, I guarantee. Oh, why is it still